Yesterday we were looking at what was the beginning of a family dispute between the mother country, England, and the teenage daughter, which would be the American colonies. The last thing we touched on was the Boston Massacre and the subsequent trial. I pointed out to you that John Adams, who is pictured here from the miniseries John Adams, which is a very good historical enactment of John Adams' life. And here he is defending the Redcoats. Yes.
I watched that.
Did you?
Yeah, my dad had it, so I just sat there and watched it.
How long ago did you watch it? This year?
I was pretty young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you think it was, you were too young to understand a lot, if you want to watch it again, you can do that for extra
I
credit.
remember this scene where the guy got like charred feathers. It like scarred me.
Ah.
It's rough.
Megan? Now, can you imagine what kind of courage it took for John Adams to do that? The sentiment in the colonies was, of course, against the soldiers, but John Adams stepped up and decided that it was something that needed to be done. There's another picture of John Adams. And I told you yesterday the results of the trial. I'm sorry, that's not John, that's Sam. That's his cousin, Sam Adams, who is called the penman of the Revolution. Sorry, I just put up a little Christmas card thing here, and it covers the name Sam Adams. That's who that is, Sam Adams. He wrote a scathing piece about what happened in Boston, in which he named the event the Boston Massacre. Now, you're familiar with the word massacre. When you hear the word massacre, what comes to mind?
A lot of people dying.
A lot of people dying. Right. Do we have that here? No. And so this is just Sam Adams' way of putting out some propaganda to try to elicit support for the colonial cause against the British. Combined with the engraving that I briefly went over before of Paul Revere's, Paul Revere engraved, sketched, and then published a picture of the massacre, and which made it look like the British soldiers are just standing there firing at a bunch of defenseless people. Those two combined together swayed many to oppose the British presence. Revere wrote this: "Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore." Could you say that the protagonists, the colonists, were guiltless? They kind of started it, didn't they? They contributed towards it. Obviously, they weren't firing muskets, but it's hard to exactly call them guiltless. All right, so that finishes up our section, the family dispute. We want to move on to the next section now, which is the eve of war. A couple of interesting quotes from John Adams that I think are important for us to understand. Adams said this: "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people." So before there was any fighting, before anything went on of a physical nature, it was within the hearts and minds of the people. He said that in 1818, long after it occurred. He also said this, that the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. There are many who try to downplay the influence of Christianity in the formation of our country, but Adams, even though he was not what we would call an evangelical Christian, he was not born again, but he recognized that the principles of Christianity were very much a part of the attitudes of the people and the principles of, from which they were trying to fight for their independence. This is what John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail during the war. They had a very heavy correspondence, so we know a lot about what they both believed from these letters. He said this: "We can't guarantee success in this war, but we can do something better. We can deserve it. Deserve success. And that is how you conduct yourselves and the principles for which you're fighting." Okay, so trouble brewing in the eve of war. The first incident following the Boston Massacre, so-called, took place in June 1772 with the ship named the Gaspee. It was an armed British customs ship which ran aground off the coast of Rhode Island. When the local people saw that the ship was immovable, 150 of them boarded the vessel, put the customs officer and his men in the small boats, and then they burned it. That one didn't make the news so much in our textbooks, but an interesting event. Now, when the officials came by and rounded up the local Rhode Islanders and questioned them, no one saw anything except one runaway slave. He admitted that he had seen what happened. Governor Hutchinson, who was over all of the of New England, announced then that the salary would no longer come from the colony, but from the crown. So by that announcement, he was saying that he was going to be independent of the local government. Sorry, I was slow getting these up as I'm talking. It then became important to those that were on the front lines of advocating actions against the British Parliament to establish a means of communication between different towns. And so there was established what's called the Committee of Correspondence. Correspondence was writing letters, essentially. This was led by Sam Adams. And it existed in order to provide information to one another in various colonies. They did have newspapers, but remember, there's no internet, there's no radio, TV, so communication was spotty at best, especially if you depend on the newspapers. The newspapers may not give you all the information. And they had even fake news back then. And so these committees of correspondence were established to communicate with one another. Locally, in Massachusetts, within 3 months, there were 80 new committees formed. And then it went intercolonial. Virginia led the way in 1773 by creating such a body as a standing committee of the House of Burgesses. So they even made it official. The House of Burgesses would have a committee of correspondence as a part of the legislature. Soon every colony had established a central committee for the exchange of ideas and information. The next major event is along the lines of the Gaspee, but much more well known, and that is the Boston Tea Party. This comes as a result of the parliamentary legislation called the Tea Act of 1773. Now, the background to this is that the British East India Tea Company operated throughout the British world and sold a lot of tea. Unfortunately, in the area of supply and demand, they had a lot more supply than there was demand. And so they were overburdened with 17 million pounds of unsold tea in their warehouses. What do? Well, if you can't sell off that tea, and if you got that much, that means prices are going to go down. You're facing a difficult situation. Kind of like GM can't sell any cruises, and so what happens? You know, the plant gets shut down. Well, the British East India Tea Company was facing bankruptcy. A collapse of this company would heavily damage England's tax revenue. Just like in the local news, the shutting down of the Lordstown plant, if that's a permanent thing, that's going to drastically affect the tax revenue not only in Lordstown but communities around. In addition to that, a number of members of Parliament had invested in the British East India Company. So they own stock. And so if that company fails, then they would be out money personally. And so I imagine they argued something at the time like we heard a few years ago, the British East India Tea Company is too big to fail. We've got to help it out. And so Parliament gave this company a monopoly. What's a monopoly? And don't tell me again. What's a monopoly? The goal of the game of Monopoly is to get a monopoly. What is a monopoly, Caleb?
When one business has, they're the only business in that.
Right. Mono means one. Monopoly means you're the only business in town. You're the only one. So that means that in the colonies, as we're talking here, there's only one company from which you can buy tea, and that's the British East India Company. In addition to that, there was a very modest tax carried over from the Townshend Acts added to the tea. But even with that tax, this tea was selling more cheaply than ever before. So if you're just looking at the money, the colonists should have been ecstatic over this deal because they're paying less for tea now than they ever had. But were they happy? No. Were they not happy? Well, and this is an important thing to remember. Letter D up here. Principle was more important than price. So you might get the impression from TV shows, movies, even textbooks that cover this time period that it was all about the money. Because all you see are signs, no taxation without representation, right? But it wasn't the money. It was the principle. And the principle was, nobody's going to tell us from whom we have to buy our tea. I don't care if it is cheaper. In fact, many of the colonists bought tea from other sources in the black market and paid more for it, just as a matter of principle, just for spite. So it wasn't the money. It's the principle of the thing. And, of course, tax collectors faced the ire of angry colonists, sometimes being subjected to tar and feathering. That was something that Stephen mentioned he saw in the miniseries John Adams, tar and feathering. I can't imagine going through that. That has to have been a horrible thing to happen to you. It was first mentioned when King Richard the Lionheart of England, remember him? In 1189 specified that robbers could be shorn of their hair and that boiling oil of tar could be poured over the newly bald pate. Feathers were then administered, apparently to add an element of ridicule. And from then on it was used. It's certainly very humiliating. I mean, I'm not sure how you ever did that stuff off. And it's bad enough to have tar poured on you, but then all the feathers, stuck to you as well. How long did it take? I don't know. Well, the reality is, I want to show you a a cartoon that relates to tar and feathering. What makes you think the rest of the class doesn't like you, Jones? Couldn't happen here. And then here's a Congress on recess. That means the congressman's coming back to his home area. Hello, my beautiful what? People. I'm home to find out what you're thinking. What are they thinking? There's feathers and there's tar. I think some of us would like to do that to our representatives, but of course that would be uncivilized today. It wasn't so much back then. All right, so the result of all this is that not one single chest of the several thousand chests of tea that were shipped by the company was landed in the hands of the consignees. In other words, with this monopoly, lower prices and everything, not one container of tea made it to the people that were buying it, were supposed to sell it. Not one. And remember, they had millions of pounds of tea sitting in warehouses needing to be sold. At Annapolis, Maryland, those people boarded a ship and burned both the cargo and the vessel. Presumably, their water was very much drinkable tea, if you don't mind the burnt taste. So now let's go to the focus here, and that's Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight. An effort was made to return the tea that came into Boston, but Governor Hutchinson refused. Hutchinson ruled that the tea must be auctioned and the tax paid within 20 days. On December 16, 1773, a meeting was called at Old South Church to appeal to the governor one last time. Old South Church is still there. It's a very interesting building. If you ever get to go to Boston, the groups I've taken to Boston, we always stop at Old South Church. A beautiful building, a lot of history there. And this is one of the things that occurred there. As they were having this meeting, it became obvious that an appeal to the governor would not be received. And there had been a prearranged signal for Sam Adams to give, and he gave it by saying, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." And at that, 150 men and boys, thinly disguised as Indians and carrying axes, in less than 3 hours, dumped 342 large cases of tea from 3 ships. Sam Adams, the leader of this activity and cousin of John, was an extremely important part of the cause of the American colonists, as it later was made clear by British General Thomas Gage, pictured here, in June 1775, when he, I'm sorry, this is not Gage, this is the king, we'll get to him in a moment. Gage offered amnesty to all revolutionaries except for John Hancock and Sam Adams. That's how important Sam Adams was to the building revolution. Now, what was the response of King George III to this action? He said, the colonists must either submit or triumph. There's no compromise. They're either going to do what we say or they're going to win. And thus the move is further toward fighting. Any questions about what we talked about today, the eve of war, looking at the Boston Tea Party as trouble began to brew? Stephen?
Why do they disguise like Indians?
Oh, that's a good question. I meant to ask you that. Why would they disguise themselves as Indians? Did anybody believe that they were Indians boarding these ships and dumping the tea out? No. So why would they do that? Speculation, because I've never read anywhere where anybody knows for certain, but I think there's an obvious answer.
Because it was not a different corpse one, so it was like they're kind of like almost being Indians because they were like the Indians and what they did to the colonists.
But if they did, if nobody really believed that they were Indians, then why? They're not going to be able to say the Indians did it, right? So why would they disguise themselves? And notice I said they were thinly disguised. It wasn't like even people at Halloween or any kind of other dress-up affair where you actually don a full costume and people can't tell who you are. Anybody who knew any of them could tell who they were. I think that the reason they did that was so that when the officials came around and asked people who did this, they could honestly say it looked like a bunch of Indians. And then they wouldn't have to lie. I don't know. That's the only real good reason I can think of. By the way, they were very careful. Unlike the Gaspé, who burnt the ship and everything, they were very careful when they're dumping out the tea. Afterwards, when you're carrying around boxes of anything, something's going to leak out. They swept the deck to get all the tea that might still be there on the deck, swept it up and threw it out. When they left the ship, they emptied their trousers in case any tea had fallen into their pants legs because they didn't want anyone to think that they were stealing tea. They got rid of any part of it. And they left the ship in better shape than what they found it, as far as being clean. During the whole thing, there was a stool that was accidentally broken, and it disappeared. The next day, it reappeared, totally fixed. So the people at the Boston Tea Party were very careful to make sure everyone understood it's only about the tea. It's only about the monopoly that we're being forced to engage in. Just dump the tea, that's all. Any other questions? Glad you brought that up and made me think of some other things I wanted to say.
I saw something where it said that the tea that they had wasn't loose leaf tea, it was like hard blocks of tea that you just shave off a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's the case or not. That's a good point. I have seen pictures that look like cakes of tea. If you look at the picture that's up there now, they're obviously in boxes, but it could have been cakes inside. But even, and let's say that that's the case, I'm not sure. But even that, you still have shavings, falling off, pieces falling off that they would have to clean up. But that's an interesting point. Any other questions or comments? So what do you think? Would you have been out there cheering them on? How many of you would have participated? You think that'd be a fun thing to do? Dump tea in the harbor. Joey?
Do you think anyone bought the tea and then resold it on the
From my information, none of the tea, not one case of the tea ever made it to being sold. Never made it to the people that were the merchants that were selling it. Which is remarkable. When you think about all the ships coming into American ports at this time, and all the tea, because people drank tea. That was the normal thing. Today, in fact, I don't know if you know this or not, but the reason why Americans have drunk coffee for so long is in reaction against the British tea. They turned to coffee. Otherwise, we'd be drinking tea like the British do. The British have this tea time every day. A spot of tea. Tea and biscuits, don't you know? But this had a huge impact on American colonists in a lot of ways, and in a kind of a minor way, I guess, as to what we drink. Any other comments? All right, I'm gonna give you the rest of the time to work on your assignment, which is to read pages 106 to 111 and do the questions on page 111 in complete sentences. This will not be due until Thursday. I'll give you some time to work on it today. On Thursday, then, we will be checking pages 102 and 111.
No.